In 1899, two lawyers from Chattanooga sat down in front of Asa Candler in Atlanta and asked him for the right to put Coca-Cola in a bottle. Candler thought bottling was a passing novelty and the real business was the soda fountain, so he said yes, and he set the price at $1. The contract they signed had no end date. There is no reliable evidence that the dollar was ever actually handed over. Here is the ground we are going to cover, where the formula came from and what it sold for while its inventor was still alive. The $1 contract, and the clause inside it that nobody in the room thought was important. The lawsuit 21 years later when sugar went mad, and the company discovered it had signed away the price. Why a bottle of Coca-Cola cost 5 cents for 73 years, which is the longest price freeze in American consumer history. What the United States Army paid to move the business overseas, and the deal in the 1980s that finally undid the whole thing at enormous expense. Start with the syrup, because everything that follows is an argument about one thing: who gets to set the price of the finished drink. A fountain sold Coca-Cola by mixing syrup with carbonated water in front of you, and the company sold the syrup. A bottle is different. Somebody else does the mixing, somebody else owns the bottle, somebody else prints the label, and the customer buys the drink from a shop rather than from a soda jerk. The moment that happens, the company is no longer selling to the drinker. It is selling to a middleman, and middlemen sign contracts. John Pemberton was an Atlanta pharmacist who had been wounded in the Civil War and had come out of it with a morphine habit and a laboratory. He spent the 1880s making patent medicines, including a coca wine that he sold as a nerve tonic, and when Atlanta went dry in 1886, he reformulated it without the alcohol. What he ended up with in May of 1886 was a caramel-colored syrup meant to be mixed with soda water and sold at a fountain as a headache remedy and a pick-me-up. The first year was not a success. Coca-Cola sold at Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta for 5 cents a glass, and the accounts for that first year suggest sales of a few glasses a day, against advertising costs that were considerably larger. Pemberton was ill, short of money, and inclined to sell pieces of whatever he owned to whoever was in front of him. Over the next 2 years, he sold interests in the formula repeatedly, sometimes to more than one person, and the resulting tangle of claims is the reason the early ownership of Coca-Cola is genuinely difficult to reconstruct. Asa Candler was another Atlanta druggist, and he was the opposite kind of man: careful, religious, relentless about detail, and interested in one product rather than 40. Between 1888 and 1891, he bought up the scattered claims to Coca-Cola one at a time. The figure usually given for the whole acquisition, every share and every claim, is around $2,300. He incorporated the Coca-Cola Company in 1892 with a capital of $100,000. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. Was giving away the bottling rights for $1 the worst deal in American business, or the best one? It cost the company its own pricing power for the better part of a century. It also built, at other people's expense, the largest distribution network in the world. See whether you still think the same thing by the end. $2,300 for the entire property. That is the number to hold on to, because within 30 years the same company would sell for $25 million, and the difference is not the recipe. Candler did not improve the drink very much. What he did was spend an enormous proportion of revenue on advertising, blanket the South with free drink coupons and painted signs and calendars and clocks, and turn a regional syrup into a national habit. By the mid-1890s, it was sold in every state. Now the contract, because the two men who walked into Candler's office in 1900 were not fools. and they were not offering him nothing. Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead were lawyers from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Thomas had seen bottled drinks sold in Cuba during the Spanish-American War and had come home convinced that the same thing would work at home. What they wanted was permission. What they were prepared to do was every hard and expensive part of the job. Candler's reasoning, as far as it can be reconstructed, was straightforward and at the time entirely sensible. Bottling in 1899 was a filthy, unreliable business. Bottles exploded, caps leaked, carbonation was inconsistent. A bad bottle carried the company's name into a customer's hand and ruined it. He had a clean, profitable business selling syrup to fountains, where a trained man mixed the drink correctly in front of the customer, and he had no wish to attach his brand to a warehouse full of glass in Tennessee. So he granted them the exclusive right to bottle Coca-Cola across almost the entire United States, and the consideration recorded was $1. Contemporaries and later company historians agree that the dollar was symbolic, and that Candler regarded the arrangement as a favor to two young men he liked. He is said to have handed over the signed agreement without ever collecting the payment. It is the cheapest transfer of a major commercial right in American corporate history, and it was not a mistake of valuation. It was a mistake about what the future looked like. The agreement contained two features that mattered far more than the dollar. The first was that it ran in perpetuity. There was no term, no renewal date, no review clause, and no mechanism by which the company could take the right back so long as the other side performed. The second was that it fixed what the bottlers would pay for syrup. The company had agreed, in writing and without limit of time, to supply the raw material at a set price forever. Read those two clauses together, and you can see the shape of the next 80 years. The Coca-Cola Company had sold, for $1, the ability to raise its own prices. Whatever happened to the cost of sugar, of labor, of shipping, of anything, the bottlers had a permanent right to buy syrup at the old number. In a world of stable prices, that is merely careless. In a world where the cost of sugar can quadruple in 18 months, it is a live grenade with the pin out. Thomas and Whitehead had almost no capital, which is why the next thing they did shaped the entire American soft drink industry. Rather than build bottling plants themselves, they divided the country into territories and sublicensed those territories to local businessmen, who put up their own money for the plant, the trucks, the bottles, and the crates. The two men in Chattanooga became parent bottlers, taking a margin between the price they paid the company and the price they charged their own licensees. By 1920, there were more than 1,000 Coca-Cola bottling plants in the United States, almost all of them locally owned, locally financed, and locally run. The company in Atlanta had built a national distribution system without spending a cent of its own money on it. Every one of those plants was a small business with its own family behind it, its own bank loan, and its own contract, and every one of those contracts descended from the perpetual one signed for $1. That is the trade, stated plainly. Coca-Cola got a country full of trucks it did not have to buy, and warehouses it did not have to build, at a moment when it had no capital to build them with. In exchange, it gave away control of the price of the drink and bound itself to a syrup price it could never raise. For 20 years, nobody had any reason to care, because the cost of sugar was boring and the volumes were rising and everybody was making money. Then sugar stopped being boring. Now the sugar crisis, because the whole arrangement met the real world in 1920 and very nearly destroyed the company. During the First World War, the United States controlled sugar prices and allocated supply. When those controls came off in 1919 and Europe's beet crop had not recovered, the price of sugar went vertical, from a few cents a pound to more than 20 cents at the peak, and Coca-Cola's syrup was mostly sugar. The timing could hardly have been worse, because the company had just changed hands. In 1919, the Candler family sold the Coca-Cola Company to a syndicate led by Ernest Woodruff, an Atlanta banker, for $25 million. It was the largest transaction the South had seen. Woodruff borrowed heavily to do it and immediately floated the company, which meant that the new owners had bank debt, public shareholders, and a raw material price that was climbing every week, all at once. Ernest Woodruff was a banker rather than a drinks man, and his response to a cost shock was a banker's response: raise the price. The company informed the bottlers that syrup would go up. The bottlers read their contracts, noticed that the price was fixed in perpetuity, and refused. The company insisted. The bottlers sued. What followed was not a squabble about a few cents a gallon. It was a fight over whether the contract that built the business was actually enforceable, and the company's own lawyers were not confident. The settlement came in 1920, and it is the reason Coca-Cola still exists in its present form. The parties agreed to abandon the fixed price and replace it with a formula. The price of syrup would move with the price of sugar, up and down, on a published basis. The perpetual term stayed. The bottlers kept their territories forever. What the company won was the right to pass its biggest cost through instead of absorbing it, and it had to buy that right by conceding almost everything else. Then the sugar price collapsed, as spikes do, and the company was left holding enormous quantities of sugar bought at the top of the market. Coca-Cola reported a loss for 1920. The stock, floated at $40, fell to under 20. Ernest Woodruff's syndicate was in serious trouble with its lenders, and the man who eventually cleaned it up was his son, Robert Woodruff, who became president in 1923 and ran the company, in one capacity or another, for the next 60 years. Robert Woodruff understood something his father did not, which is that in this business the contract was not the enemy. The bottlers were an army. They were 1,000 independent, motivated, locally connected small businesses with their own capital at risk, and they would sell Coca-Cola harder than any employee ever would. So he stopped fighting them and started arming them. Standardized coolers, standardized signage, quality inspectors, delivery routing, and a permanent, deafening insistence on one thing above all others, which was that the drink must be within arm's reach of desire. Now what the company actually owned, because while the bottling fight was running, the federal government was in court trying to establish that the product itself was misdescribed and dangerous. If it had won, there would have been nothing for anybody to license. The cocaine had gone in 1903. Candler had already reduced it, and in that year the company moved to spent coca leaves, the residue left after the active alkaloid has been extracted, so that the flavor survived and the drug did not. The arrangement that supplies it is still in place. A chemical works in New Jersey, now part of the Step-End Company, holds a federal license to import coca leaf, extracts the cocaine for pharmaceutical use, and sells the spent leaf on to Atlanta as a flavoring. It is the only legal coca importer in the United States. That left caffeine, and caffeine was the government's target. In 1909, federal agents stopped a shipment of syrup crossing the state line from Georgia into Tennessee and seized it, and the case that followed carries one of the great American case names: the United States against 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. The government's chief chemist, Harvey Wiley, who had driven the Pure Food and Drug Act through Congress, wanted caffeine declared an added and deleterious ingredient. The second half of the government's argument was about the name. If the drink no longer contained meaningful quantities of coca and had never contained much cola, then calling it Coca-Cola was a misbranding, and the company's entire property was a lie printed on a bottle. Read the two claims together, and you can see what was at stake. One would have forced a reformulation. The other would have destroyed the trademark, which is to say the asset. The trial took place in Chattanooga in 1911. It ran for a month, and it was one of the earliest occasions on which American courts had to weigh scientific testimony about a food additive. The company brought its own researchers, the government brought Wiley's, and the judge ended it with a directed verdict for Coca-Cola on the ground that caffeine was not an added ingredient at all, but an original part of the recipe. The government appealed, lost again, and went to the Supreme Court. In 1916, the Supreme Court reversed, holding that caffeine could indeed be an added ingredient within the meaning of the act, and sent the case back for trial. The company did not risk a second trial. It settled, paid the government's costs, and quietly reduced the caffeine content of the drink. The formula was changed by litigation rather than by taste, and the whole affair had cost more in legal fees than the company had spent on anything except advertising. 4 years later, the courts handed Coca-Cola something worth far more than it had lost. A rival was selling a near-identical drink called Coke, and the company sued. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1920, and the opinion was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who dealt with the misdescription point in a single sentence. The name, he wrote, had come to mean a single thing coming from a single source, and well known to the community. It described a drink, not its ingredients. There was a third piece of property, and it was made of glass. By 1915, the imitators were so numerous that the company ran a competition among bottle makers for a container that could be recognized in the dark, or by touch, or lying broken on the ground. The winning design came from the Root Glass Company of Terre Haute, Indiana, and the story its designers told afterwards was that they had gone to the library, looked up the cocoa pod, and copied its ribs, having confused it with the coca leaf. The most recognizable object in 20th century commerce may be based on a mistake in a reference book. What matters here is what the shape became. Decades later, the contour bottle itself was registered as a trademark, which is an unusual thing to achieve. The company had turned a piece of packaging into a protected asset in its own right. And note where that asset sat. The bottles were bought, filled, delivered, and owned by the independent bottlers. The shape of them belonged to Atlanta. That is the moment the modern company exists. Holmes had confirmed that the property was the name, and that the name had detached itself from the recipe entirely. Everything else in this story is a consequence. If what you own is a word and a syrup formula, then trucks, plants, glass, and territory are somebody else's problem, and you will happily sign them away, for $1 if necessary, to whoever will take them off your hands. Now the nickel, because the strangest fact in this entire story is the price. A bottle of Coca-Cola cost 5 cents in 1886, and it cost 5 cents in 1959. 73 years, through 2 world wars, a depression, and an inflation that reduced the value of the dollar to a fraction of what it had been, and the number on the bottle did not move. Economists have written papers trying to explain it, because on the face of it, it should not be possible. Part of the answer is the contract. The bottlers could not be forced to raise their prices, and the company could not raise the syrup price beyond the sugar formula. So the pressure that normally moves a retail price was blocked in both directions. But the more interesting part of the answer is advertising. Coca-Cola had spent decades putting the figure 5 cents on every calendar, tray, clock, sign, and painted wall in America. The price was not a number on a ticket, it was part of the trademark. Then there was the machine. By the 1930s, an enormous share of bottle sales went through vending machines and coolers that took a single coin, and the coin was a nickel. To raise the price to 6 cents, you needed a machine that could take a nickel and a penny, which meant re-engineering hundreds of thousands of machines. To go to 10 cents was to double the price in one step, which the company was certain would lose it the volume that the entire system depended on. The company's preferred solution to this problem has to be one of the great episodes in the history of American lobbying. Robert Woodruff is reported to have approached the United States Treasury to ask whether it might consider minting a 7.5-cent coin. The request was not granted. In the absence of a coin that suited it, the company tried other routes, including machines that dispensed an unpredictable free bottle at intervals, so that the average price could rise while the posted price stayed at a nickel. A competitor worked out what this meant and attacked straight through it. In the middle of the Depression, Pepsi-Cola, which had already been bankrupt twice, began selling 12 ounces for 5 cents in reclaimed beer bottles, against Coca-Cola's 6.5 ounces at the same price. The advertising was a jingle that told you the arithmetic in 8 seconds, and it worked, because a family with no money could count. Coca-Cola could not answer. It could not cut its price, because the price was 5 cents and had been for 50 years and was printed on half the walls in America. It could not raise the size of the bottle, because the bottles belonged to 1,000 independent bottlers who had bought their equipment to fill that specific shape and had a contract that let them refuse. The one competitive lever a business normally reaches for was welded shut at both ends by decisions made in 1899 and 1920. So the answer had to come from somewhere else, and it came from advertising and from ubiquity. More coolers, more machines, more signs, Santa Claus, the war, the idea that the drink was not a purchase but a condition of ordinary life. That is a strategy invented under constraint. Coca-Cola became the most heavily advertised product on earth partly because advertising was the only weapon its own contracts had left it. Set that against what the same company would do in the 1980s, and you can measure how much the world had changed. In 1937, the largest consumer brand in America could not raise its price by 1 cent, and considered redesigning the currency of the United States a more practical option. The price of a Coca-Cola was not a business decision by then. It was an institution with 1,000 independent owners, several 100,000 machines, and 40 years of advertising behind it. One thing did go the company's way in those years, and it arrived by accident from Washington. National prohibition closed the saloons in 1920 and left tens of millions of Americans looking for something to buy in a public place, and the soda fountain was already there, on the corner, selling a cold drink for 5 cents. Coca-Cola's volumes rose through the 1920s on the back of a law that had nothing to do with it, and a good deal of the growth that carried the company through the sugar disaster came from drinkers with nowhere else to go. The nickel finally broke in the late 1950s, and it broke because inflation after the Second World War made the arithmetic impossible. Bottlers went to 6 cents and then 10. The company itself had spent the intervening years quietly restructuring what it could, converting old perpetual contracts where bottlers would agree, and building the modern arrangement in which the company sells concentrate rather than finished syrup and prices it as it sees fit. But the old contracts were still out there, and they were still perpetual. Before the war, there was already a foreign business, run at arm's length in the same way as the domestic one. The Coca-Cola Export Corporation was set up at the start of the 1930s to license bottlers abroad, and by the end of the decade, the largest of those operations by far was in Germany, where the drink had become genuinely popular and was being sold at the Berlin Olympics. What happened to that business when the war came is the most peculiar footnote in the company's history. Cut off from America, Unable to import the concentrate that was the entire basis of his license, the head of the German operation, Max Keith, kept the plants running by inventing a new drink out of whatever was legally available: whey, apple pumice, and other leftovers of the food industry. He called it Fanta. It sold in the millions of cases through the war, and when the war ended, Keith handed the business and the brand back to Atlanta. That is the licensing model working exactly as designed, in the worst circumstances imaginable. The company owned a name and a formula and could not reach its own factory. The local operator owned the plant, the staff, and the customers, and had every reason to keep both alive. A wholly owned subsidiary in Germany in 1943 would have been seized as enemy property. A licensed local business run by a local man was not, and Fanta is still on the shelf 80 years later. Now the war, because the single most valuable thing that ever happened to Coca-Cola was paid for by the American taxpayer, and it was not a subsidy anyone objected to at the time. In 1941, with the United States entering the war and sugar about to be rationed, Robert Woodruff issued an order that reads like advertising copy and turned out to be strategy: that every man in uniform would get a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he was and whatever it cost the company. The commercial problem was sugar rationing. Civilian soft drink manufacturers had their sugar cut hard, which would have meant shutting plants and losing shelf space to whoever survived. The company's answer was to get Coca-Cola classified as essential to the war effort, on the argument that it was good for morale, and supplies destined for the armed forces were exempted from the civilian ration. That single classification decision was worth more than any advertising campaign the company ever ran. Then came the part that changed the shape of the business permanently. To deliver a 5-cent Coca-Cola to a soldier in North Africa or the Pacific, you cannot ship the finished drink, because it is mostly water and the shipping space belongs to ammunition. So the company shipped concentrate and built bottling plants where the troops were. 64 bottling plants were established overseas during the war, and a substantial part of the cost of moving the equipment and the men who ran them was carried by the military. The men who went with the plants were company employees given quasi-military status as technical observers, and the troops called them Coca-Cola colonels. About 150 of them followed the armies through Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, setting up plants behind the front and keeping them running. By the end of the war, the services had been supplied with something in the region of 5 billion bottles, and the company had a manufacturing footprint on 3 continents that it had not paid full price for. One thing before we go on: if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of American financial history every single day. If you want the next one, that is the whole ask. Consider what that meant in 1945. Coca-Cola came out of the war with plants, staff, distribution, and local licenses across Europe and Asia, and with an entire generation of American servicemen for whom the drink was a piece of home. Its rivals came out of the war with a rationed sugar allocation and a domestic business. It is genuinely difficult to name another instance in which a war so comprehensively built one company's international network, and it was done in the open, with the approval of the War Department. Not everybody abroad was pleased about it. In 1950, the French National Assembly debated a bill to restrict or ban the drink outright, pushed by a coalition of wine growers who saw a competitor and communists who saw the United States in a bottle. The word coined for it was Coca-Colonization, and it was not meant kindly. The company lobbied, the State Department took an interest, the French press had a wonderful time, and the bill never became effective law. The episode is worth a moment because of what it says about the asset. Nobody in Paris was objecting to a flavored syrup. They were objecting to what the name had come to mean, which is precisely the property Holmes had described 30 years earlier, and precisely the thing that no bottling contract had ever transferred. The company owned the argument. The bottlers only owned the glass. The bill for that arrangement, incidentally, was not zero for Coca-Cola. The company supplied the drink at 5 cents when its own costs overseas were far higher, and it absorbed the difference, exactly as Woodruff's order said it would. That is the part usually left out when the story is told as a piece of cynicism. It was a loss made deliberately, in the expectation that the habit would be worth more than the margin, and it was one of the best commercial judgments ever made. Now the reckoning, because the perpetual contracts did not go away. Through the 1960s and 70s, the bottling system that had been a strength became a problem. There were still hundreds of independent bottlers, many of them second and third generation family firms, holding territories in perpetuity on contracts written for a world of local delivery and neighborhood grocers. Supermarkets buy nationally. Chains negotiate nationally. A national customer cannot be served by 400 separate owners with 400 separate prices. The company's problem was that it could not simply reorganize. It did not own the territories. Any national pricing decision, any packaging change, any new product, had to be sold to hundreds of independent proprietors who had a legal right to say no, and who had inherited that right from a signature made in 1899. Coca-Cola had built the most powerful brand in the world and rented out the last mile of it forever. The territories had a second enemy in the 1970s, and it was the antitrust authorities. An exclusive territory is, on its face, a restraint of trade. It means that a bottler in one city may not sell into the next city, so two bottlers of the same brand never compete on price. The Federal Trade Commission took proceedings against the soft drink industry on exactly that basis, and for most of the decade, the entire franchise system was under threat of being broken up by regulators rather than by contract. The industry's answer was Congress. In 1980, a statute was passed, the Soft Drink Interbrand Competition Act, which protected exclusive territorial licenses in the soft drink business specifically, on the argument that competition between brands was fierce enough to make competition within a brand unnecessary. It is one of the clearest examples in American commercial history of an industry losing an argument in front of a regulator and then winning it in the legislature. Sit with what that means for a moment. A contract signed for $1 in 1899 by two lawyers and a druggist who thought bottling was a passing fad ended up being defended in the United States Congress 81 years later, and the law passed. Nobody in that room in Atlanta had any idea they were writing the constitution of an industry. There was also a legal problem underneath, which was the syrup formula agreed in 1920. It tied the price to sugar, and by the 1970s the company wanted to use high fructose corn syrup, which was cheaper. The old contracts specified what they specified. A long and expensive round of renegotiation followed in which bottlers were persuaded, one at a time, onto new agreements, generally in exchange for money, territory, or both. The instrument that broke the deadlock was an amended bottler's contract offered in 1978. In exchange for the right to sweeten with high fructose corn syrup and to move the concentrate price with a published index rather than with the sugar market alone, the company offered terms that made signing worth the bottler's while. Many signed. Many did not, and those who did not kept contracts descended from 1899, which is why the problem had to be solved by purchase in the end, rather than by negotiation. Meanwhile, every new product ran into the same wall. When the company launched a new drink, it had to persuade the bottlers to make and carry it, and their agreements were written around a specific product, not a portfolio. Diet Coke, launched in 1982 into what turned out to be an enormous market, required its own arrangements with the bottling system before a single bottle could be filled. A company that has to hold a negotiation before it can respond to a competitor is not really in control of its own business. So in the 1980s, Coca-Cola did the only thing left. It bought its bottlers back. Through the first half of the decade, it acquired territory after territory, and in 1986, it combined the largest of them into a new company, Coca-Cola Enterprises, and floated it. The point of the float was the balance sheet. The parent kept 49%, which was enough to control it in practice, and just short of the level that would have forced it to carry the enormous debt on its own accounts. The 49% was not a detail. It was the entire design, and it was the work of a management team under Roberto Goizueta that thought about the balance sheet before it thought about the drink. Buying the bottlers meant taking on billions in borrowing and a great deal of heavy, low-margin plant. Holding just under half of the vehicle that owned them meant the parent could report its own results without any of that, while in practice deciding what the bottler did. The arrangement was legal, disclosed, and widely imitated afterwards. It is worth being precise about the scale, because the numbers are the whole point of this episode. To reassemble the rights that had been sold for $1, the company spent billions of dollars over roughly a decade, and then engineered a listed vehicle whose main function was to hold the debt used to do it. The $1 was not a rounding error. It was a liability that took 90 years and a corporate restructuring to discharge. Set the two ends of the story against each other. $1 in 1899 against several billion dollars in the 1980s to undo it. There is no discount rate in the world that makes those figures comparable, and that is exactly what makes the deal interesting. The mistake was not in the price, it was in the term. The clause that cost the money was the one nobody negotiated, because nobody in the room in 1899 imagined the arrangement lasting a century. Now the drink itself, briefly, because 1985 is when the tension inside this system became visible to the public. Pepsi had spent years running blind taste tests and taking share, and the company's response was to reformulate Coca-Cola and replace it. New Coke was launched in April 1985 and withdrawn 79 days later after a public reaction that the company's own market research had entirely failed to predict. You will find people who insist the whole thing was a plot, staged to cover a switch from sugar to corn syrup or to manufacture affection for the original. The company has always denied it, and its own executives said afterwards, more or less, that they were not that clever. The plainer reading is that a company which had spent a century unable to change its price had also come to believe it could not change anything else either, and then overcorrected. What the episode proved, though, is the thing this whole story has been circling. Coca-Cola never really owned its customers. It owned a trademark and a concentrate formula, and everything between that formula and a person's hand was owned, contractually, by somebody else, or in the case of the brand's meaning, by nobody at all. The company found out in 1985 that it did not have the right to change the drink, and it had found out in 1920 that it did not have the right to change the price. If you want proof of how the company values that formula against everything else it owns, the clearest example is India. In 1977, the Indian government, applying a law that required foreign companies to reduce their holdings in local subsidiaries and to transfer technical know-how to their Indian partners, told Coca-Cola that continuing to trade there meant handing over the formula and diluting its ownership. Coca-Cola looked at a market of 600 million people and walked out of the country. It stayed out for 16 years. India developed its own brands in the gap. The government even sponsored one, and Coca-Cola did not return until 1993 after the rules changed. Set that against the dollar. A company that gave away the right to bottle its drink across the whole United States for a token payment gave up an entire subcontinent, rather than let anybody read the recipe. That is not inconsistency. That is a company that knows exactly which of its assets is the one that cannot be replaced. The same logic explains the other great relationship in the business, which is the one with McDonald's. It began in the 1950s. It is the largest fountain account in the world, and for decades it was famously governed by nothing that looked like the bottler's contracts at all. The fountain channel was where the company had kept its pricing power since 1886, because there it sold syrup to a customer who bought again next month, on terms that could be revisited. Nothing perpetual, nothing inherited, nothing signed for $1. Now the modern shape, because the system today is the answer to all of it. The Coca-Cola company sells concentrate. It owns the trademark, sets the marketing, and takes a high margin on a light product that ships cheaply. The bottling, which is capital intensive, low margin and heavy, is done by large bottling partners under agreements that have terms and renewal dates and territories that can be redrawn. Having spent billions buying the bottlers, the company spent the following years selling them again, deliberately. Look at where the money sits in that arrangement, and the last 80 years make sense immediately. Selling concentrate is one of the most profitable activities in the consumer goods industry, because the product is light, cheap to make, and sold under a name people ask for. Bottling is the opposite. Trucks, plant, glass, aluminum, drivers, and fuel, for a margin that runs in the low single figures. The dollar contract of 1899 did not just give away a right. It handed the low-margin half of the business to somebody else, permanently, and the company spent 90 years discovering that this was both its worst mistake and its luckiest one. That is not a reversal, it is the lesson learned. The thing worth owning is the part that cannot be replicated, which is the brand and the formula, and the thing not worth owning is a fleet of trucks. But you must own the contract that governs the relationship between them, and it must have an end date. Every modern franchise agreement in the food and drink industry, in some sense, descends from what happened to Coca-Cola between 1899 and 1920. There is one more figure worth putting on the table. Asa Candler bought the whole property for around $2,300 and sold the company in 1919 for $25 million, which is a return that would satisfy anybody. He was mayor of Atlanta. He gave the land and the money that moved Emory University, and he died a rich and consequential man. By any personal measure, the man who gave away bottling for $1 did extremely well out of Coca-Cola. And the bottlers did well too, which is the part that complicates the moral of the story. Whole family fortunes across the American South were built on territories granted under those contracts, some of them acquired for a few $1,000s in 1900 and sold back to the company for tens or hundreds of millions 80 years later. The Lupton family of Chattanooga, who took on the parent bottling rights early, ended up among the wealthiest families in the region. The dollar contract created more millionaires than most stock markets. So come back to the question, was it the worst deal in American business or the best one? On the arithmetic of the license itself, it is indefensible. A perpetual right with a fixed input price and no review clause is the sort of thing a first-year lawyer is taught to spot, and it cost the company its pricing power for the better part of a century and billions of dollars to unwind. On the arithmetic of the business, It is close to unanswerable the other way. In 1899, Coca-Cola was a syrup company with no capital, no trucks, no plants, and no way of getting a bottle into a shop in Nebraska. Within 20 years, it had 1,000 plants, paid for by other people, all of them owned by locals with every incentive to sell. Nobody has ever found a cheaper way to build a national distribution network, because there is not one. And the counterfactual is not free either, which is the part that usually goes missing when this deal is called a blunder. For Candler to have bottled Coca-Cola himself in 1900, he would have had to raise capital, build plants in dozens of states, buy trucks and horses and glass, hire and supervise thousands of people at a distance of 1,000 miles, and do all of it while carbonation was still unreliable and the brand was young enough to be killed by a few bad bottles. He had $100,000 of capital and a business he understood. Whether a man in that position was wrong to hand the risk to somebody else is a genuinely open question, and it is still the question every franchisor asks. What is not in doubt is where the money went, and that is the honest summary of the whole affair. The value created by Coca-Cola in the 20th century was split, by accident, between the company that owned the formula and several hundred families that owned the right to put it in glass. That split was decided in an afternoon in 1899 by a man who thought bottling was a fad, for a consideration of $1, which as far as anybody can tell was never paid.